Now we introduce to you an international guest, but formerly of Otago Uni, now of Australian National University. Please welcome to speak to Games to help the conversation on genetic technologies, Fabien Medvecky. Kia ora.
Kia ora, ko Fabien toku ingoa. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm Fabien. I'm at the Australian National University, and I'm well aware that not only do I live across the pond, but I'm also holding you back from lunch. So I might be by the most hated person in this place at the moment, but you'll forgive me. I'm quite nice sometimes. I'm here speaking on behalf of a whole bunch of people, so I want to acknowledge that this is not specifically my work, it's a whole bunch of us. I'm just the one who was tasked with doing this, and I'm very glad to be doing so. Let me try this. I think it should come as no surprise if I say that New Zealand is a bit of a crossroad when it comes to conservation, to our use of technologies. We've talked a lot about novel technologies that will be helpful for conservation and for biodiversity, and in particular here our interest is in genetic technologies. Certainly these will be incredibly useful for us, but also the conversation and the regulations around genetic technology in New Zealand haven't really moved very much for the last 20 years. It's been quite stuck. And that makes it really quite interesting as a possibility for us going forward. Specifically, how do we have a meaningful discussion around genetic technology for the environment in New Zealand? And I want to focus here on the idea of a meaningful discussion, because often we have discussions, but then what do we do with these? And so in a way, thinking about the theme of the conference, about building on momentum, we wanted to have a discussion that we could do something with. And particularly what we were interested in was tangible deliberations. Deliberations are something that we can actually work with when we make decisions going forward. That can inform policy, decision-making, and those kind of things. Whether they get made those way, that's up to the policymakers, and I'm not involved at that level, but we want to provide the information that can be useful for that specifically. So we asked two broad questions. What, if any, genetic technology would be useful or might be on the table, and in which context for Aotearoa? And secondly, if we were to have these technologies, what rules, regulations, oversights, and so forth would be required so that we could have these technologies? Fundamentally, we're asking about which technologies and what kind of governance. We have multiple publics to talk to, many people, many different groups, and so we had multiple processes, but underlying all of this for us was a really important questions about how do you create a space where you can have those conversations? And this is going back to one of the talks, just a couple of talks back, about having the right kind of space. And for us, this was particularly important, specifically to invite and allow people to come and speak who may not either know much about the topic or necessarily be interested about the topic. Because one of the things that's really interesting when we look at the kind of history of innovation is that people don't really care until they do. And then when they do, they can easily get polarized. So having people come in, even when they don't think they care or don't necessarily feel they have the knowledge, is hugely important right from the inception of the project. So we did this, and I want to share with you some of the processes and some of the very preliminary findings we're still doing through the project now, so we won't really have the full findings for another couple of months. But one of our partners, Te Tira Whakamataki, did the engagement with Māori specifically, and they gathered Māori perspectives around the use of genetic technology for the environment. And they have an existing network and great relationships, which is incredibly useful to be able to gather this kind of, and engage in this kind of conversations. And part of their aspirations and interest was to think about what information and what kind of language and knowledge was required for Māori to have the kind of discussions around, conversation around genetic technologies that they might want to have, that we might want to have as a community, and so on. And so they did this in 3 prongs. They did a broad national survey that compared both Pākehā and Māori views around genetic technology for the environment. They had some specific group conversations around genetic technology scenarios, and scenarios is something we've used throughout the project. And then they also had one-on-one conversations. Give you some idea of the scenarios. They talked about things like de-extinction or things like gene drive for predator control. And they used those as prompts to start having a conversation around where we might be comfortable with the technology, what might work, where might the discomforts be. And then they would probe and keep going through conversations to find out some of the perspectives. from the survey, there's some interesting findings. Firstly, about half of New Zealanders are tentatively supportive of the idea of gene technologies. Gene technology is a broad term. There's everything from gene drive that might be about 20, 30 years away for mammals like rats, to things like gene silencing that we heard from Ocean and Field that is actually just about here, if we want it to be. So it's a really whole range of technology. There is a proportion of the population who is overall fairly reticent against any form of genetic technology, that idea just makes them uncomfortable. But I think what's really interesting is that actually a whole chunk of the population just feel like they don't know enough. And I suspect it's far more than this. These are those who say, I don't know enough. I think many people who are tentative because they don't feel they know enough. And I think that's a really big part of this discussion. On the broad public engagement that we did with Marie, and Marie talked a bit about this yesterday, we used a framework that we call Explore, Refine and Deliberate. We did a broad exploratory study where we spoke to a number of groups across the country. We spoke to about 200 people in workshops. If you've ever done workshops, that's a lot of workshops with a lot of people. And then we took the information from that and refined it by talking to experts to work out some scenarios. One of them is gene silencing for varromites. Others are gene drive for rats as predator control. So we use these scenarios, and we are now going through a deliberation stage where we're going out and getting people to come up with, to basically come to consensus around what technology they would have and how they would like it implemented. But I want to say a little bit more about the explore phase, because we were promised to talk about games, and I want to mention this a little bit. For us, the challenge was, how do you have a conversation? How do you build trust and confidence when you don't have a relationship with people? And particularly when there is this sort of epistemic discomfort. Let me briefly explain what I mean by this. We didn't know the people we were going to. We were going to places like rural communities in Otago. We would email them a few times. They'd organised a meeting for us with some of the local communities, but we didn't know the people. We had no relationship to start with. How do you start having a conversation? And when I say epistemic discomfort, I'm talking about something that in psychology and philosophy is often referred to as epistemic anxiety. Basically, it means feeling uncomfortable because you don't know anything. And let me give you an example. I know nothing about cars. But when I go to my mechanic, they open the bonnet and they say, I did this and this and that. And I lean over and I go, yeah, it's great. I haven't got a clue. I don't even know what I'm looking at. But I feel uncomfortable because I feel like I'm an idiot because I don't know enough. And instead of going, I don't know enough, I nod and I don't say anything. And that's fine as a mechanic. It's a problem if you want to have a conversation with somebody. So how do you overcome that? That's really, really quite complicated. And so for us, we made games. This isn't our ideas. We stole the idea from a process in Europe known as the Nano Dialogues. That was a very big project, pan-European project around engagement around nanotechnology. But the idea is games are comfortable. We use what's called heritage game or legacy games, things like, you all know, Snakes and Ladder, Jenga, games we all know. And we modify them so that people would gain both the language and some fundamental knowledge that makes you then capable of engaging in a conversation. To use Marie's word, I invite you to enjoy us at the back during the lunch break. But we'll have the games there for you to have a look at if you want to. They really are made primarily to make people feel comfortable to engage in the conversation. Because once you have that, you can have in-depth conversation. Following the games, we had about an hour conversation after that in our workshops, and we took those informations to build the scenarios and to work out perspectives that people would have. And in the deliberation phase, we present people with their perspectives that have come up. And you'll be familiar with these. They're things like, we need more tools. Genetic technologies offer incredible possibilities, through to things like, we should stop playing God. These are perspectives we've all heard. We have them cashed out so that people can, participants, when they engage with the discussion, can see what others view already, so they can feel comfortable with the discussion. And then they are asked to come to a consensus in this new deliberation process that we're doing now around which technologies they want and how they would want them regulated. What do you want in your toolbox? So some preliminary findings we have so far, and I can't say too much about the deliberation, but I can tell you some things we've got. There certainly is an appetite for a discussion around genetic technology, and certainly the winds have changed. There is absolutely a desire for this discussion, but it's conditional on control and oversights, on independent and scientific oversight. More respondents said they certainly wanted any decision to have hapari at the table in the discussion. That's very important. It's also true that people want to have a say in this and that the views are nuanced. They don't just want to have a yes or no decision. It's not a yes or no decision. It's a when and how and about and the details. That matters. But I also want to touch on one really important lesson that for me was really, really big in this. And it's about the importance of process. And we've talked a lot about the importance of relationships in knowledge making, that to have good knowledge, we need good relationships, and relationships is really important. But I want to suggest that particularly when we do engagement, there's something else that goes on, and it's about the space we create. I work mostly on public engagement and public and science communication. And the more I reflect on this, the more I think, and I've reflected a lot of this in this process, has been really, for me, interesting, that I think what really you do when you do public engagement is you create a space for the kind of communication and engagement you want to have. And that space creation is hugely important, because without the right space, you can't have the right relationships. And I think that's, for me, been a really, really important thing to think about. What space do we create so that we can have the kind of discussions, the kind of relationships we want to have, so we can make the decisions we should be making? Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Fabien, and for the invitation to go and enjoy the games over here. So can we just have a kana wave? Kana wave over there, so you know where you're heading to, because we are heading to lunch. But please be back on time. We're going to stick to 12:50 as our time back in here, as we have a very special video we're showing, and we don't want you to miss it. It's going to be an inspirational highlight of the conference as well. Spoiler alert, you might be moved by the message from the late Sir Rob Fenwick, and also by a very exciting update. I'll quickly bless our kai to make sure it's all the more delicious. Tēnei te mihi, nau mai ngā hua o papa ahurewa ranginui ki te kai, whitiki kia ora, haumi e, hui e, TIAKI e, mauri ora kia tātou. Please go and enjoy your lunch, and do remember to come back at 12:50. Kia ora tātou, enjoy the games as well.